The first time I saw humans, I thought they were the most fragile species in the galaxy. This was during my assignment as a cultural observer aboard the Zephyrian flagship Dominion's Edge, tasked with documenting the conquest of the third spiral arm. My species, the Veltar, had served as neutral observers for over 3 millennia, recording the rise and fall of countless civilizations across the cosmos. We prided ourselves on our objectivity, our ability to witness without interference, to document without emotion. The human homeworld called Earth hung before us like a blue marble streaked with white clouds. Commander HFY of the Zephyrian Empire stood beside me on the observation deck, his forearms crossed in satisfaction. The Zephyrians were conquerors by nature, their crystalline exoskeletons gleaming under the ship's artificial lights. They had claimed 17 star systems in the past decade alone, each conquest swift and decisive. "Look at them," HFY rumbled, his voice like grinding stone. "No energy shields around their planet. No orbital defense platforms. Their largest vessels barely qualify as frigates by our standards." He activated the holographic display showing Earth's military capabilities. The numbers were laughably small compared to the Zephyrian fleet. "This will be over within a solar cycle." I adjusted my recording apparatus, a bio-organic device that interfaced directly with my nervous system. Everything I experienced would be preserved in the Veltar archives, another chapter in the endless story of galactic conquest. The humans had been broadcasting radio signals for barely 2 centuries, had achieved faster-than-light travel only 50 years ago. They were technological infants stumbling into a galaxy ruled by ancient powers. The invasion began at dawn on the human continent they called North America. Zephyrian dropships descended through the atmosphere like metallic rain, their energy weapons carving through human aircraft as if they were made of paper. I watched through the ship's sensors as human cities burned, their primitive weapons sparking harmlessly against Zephyrian armor. But something strange happened in those first hours. Instead of surrendering, the humans scattered. Their military command structure, decimated in the opening strikes, should have collapsed entirely. Yet somehow coordination continued. Small groups of human soldiers began appearing everywhere, using tactics I had never seen before. They struck at supply lines, communication nodes, isolated patrols. They seemed to materialize from shadows and disappear just as quickly. "Insurgent tactics," HFY dismissed when I pointed this out. "We've seen this before. Desperate species always resort to these methods in their final days. It will burn itself out within a month." I recorded everything meticulously. The way human fighters would attack Zephyrian positions with weapons that should have been useless, somehow finding weak points in armor that had withstood plasma cannons. The way they communicated using methods so primitive that Zephyrian intelligence couldn't intercept them. The way they kept fighting even when their chances of survival approached 0. 3 months passed. The humans had lost every major battle, every strategic position. Their government had fallen. Their military was shattered. Their major cities lay in ruins. By all logic, by every historical precedent I had observed, they should have surrendered or been extinct. Instead, the resistance grew stronger. I began spending more time studying individual human fighters captured during raids. They were brought aboard our ship for interrogation and study. Each one was physically unremarkable compared to other species I had cataloged. No natural armor, no enhanced strength, no psychic abilities. They were soft, vulnerable, and should have been easy to break. The first prisoner I interviewed was a human, female named Sarah Chen. She had been leading a group that had destroyed 3 Zephyrian supply convoys, using nothing but improvised explosives and stolen weapons. When I asked her why she continued fighting when victory was impossible, she looked at me with eyes that held no fear, only a quiet determination I had never seen before. "You don't understand," she said in heavily accented galactic standard. "This isn't about winning or losing anymore. This is about who we are. You can take our cities, our weapons, even our lives, but you can't take what makes us human." I pressed her to explain what she meant, but she simply smiled and refused to say more. Over the following weeks, I interviewed dozens of other prisoners. Soldiers, civilians, even children who had been caught running messages between resistance cells. Each gave me a similar answer, phrased in different ways but carrying the same incomprehensible message. The pattern began to disturb me. In all my centuries of observation, I had seen species fight desperately for survival, seen them rage against extinction, seen them make incredible sacrifices for their young. But this was different. The humans weren't just fighting to survive. They were fighting for something else entirely, something that seemed to transcend individual existence. Commander HFY grew increasingly frustrated as the months turned to years. The Zephyrian Empire had expected to strip mine Earth's resources and move on to the next conquest. Instead, they found themselves locked in an endless guerrilla war that was draining their fleet's resources. Every convoy needed heavy escort. Every outpost required constant reinforcement. Every day brought new attacks from enemies who seemed to multiply rather than diminish. How do they keep recruiting new fighters? HFY demanded during one of our regular briefings. We've eliminated their leadership dozens of times. We've destroyed their training facilities. We control their food distribution. Where are these new insurgents coming from? I had been wondering the same thing. The mathematical models didn't work. The humans should have run out of volunteers months ago. Their population was declining under Zephyrian occupation. Their infrastructure was crippled. Their hope should have been crushed. Yet somehow, for every human fighter killed, 2 more seemed to take their place. The answer came to me during my last interview with Sarah Chen before her scheduled execution. She had been captured again after escaping from a detention facility and leading a raid that freed 300 other prisoners. This time she was scheduled for immediate termination. Aren't you afraid to die? I asked her, genuinely curious. Fear was such a universal constant among sentient species that its absence fascinated me. Of course I'm afraid, she replied. But fear isn't what matters. What matters is what comes after me. I didn't understand then. I wouldn't understand for several more months. But those words stayed with me, recorded faithfully in my biological memory banks, waiting for the moment when their true meaning would become clear. The human child couldn't have been more than 12 standard years old. She sat in the detention cell, her small hands folded in her lap, showing no signs of the terror that should have overwhelmed any young creature facing interrogation by alien conquerors. Her name was Maya, and she had been caught carrying coded messages between resistance cells in the ruins of what humans called New York. I had requested permission to interview her myself, though I wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps it was scientific curiosity about how human psychology developed in the young. Perhaps it was something else entirely, something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. "Hello, Maya," I said, activating my translation matrix to speak in her native language. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to understand something." She looked up at me with dark eyes that seemed far older than her years. "You're the observer, aren't you? The one who records everything." Her knowledge surprised me. "How do you know about me?" "People talk," she said simply. "They say you watch everything but never help anyone. They say your people just write things down while others suffer." The accusation stung in a way I hadn't expected. The Veltar had always prided themselves on their neutrality, our non-interference. We documented history without becoming part of it. Yet somehow this human child's words made that principle sound less noble than I had always believed. "Why do you fight?" I asked her. "You're just a child. You should be in school, playing with friends, living a normal life. Instead, you're risking everything for a cause that cannot possibly succeed." Maya tilted her head, considering my question with surprising seriousness. "My grandfather told me stories before the invasion, stories about our ancestors who fought against impossible odds, not because they thought they could win, but because some things are worth fighting for even if you lose." "What things?" I pressed. "The idea that people should be free to choose their own path. The idea that no one has the right to own another person's life. The idea that hope is something you create, not something you're given." I had heard similar sentiments from adult prisoners, but hearing them from someone so young struck me differently. This wasn't learned propaganda or desperate rationalization. This was something deeper, something that seemed to be woven into the very fabric of human consciousness. Over the following weeks, I observed the effects of this young girl's capture on the local resistance network. Logic suggested that losing a communications courier, especially a child, should have disrupted their operations. Instead, the opposite occurred. 3 new message runners appeared within days, all of them even younger than Maya. When one was captured, others emerged to take their place. I began to realize that I was witnessing something unprecedented in my centuries of observation. The humans weren't just fighting an occupying force. They were engaged in something that transcended traditional warfare entirely. Each captured fighter became a symbol that inspired others. Each execution became a rallying point for increased resistance. The Zephyrians' attempts at suppression were actually strengthening their enemy. Commander HFY called an emergency strategy meeting. The holographic display showed resistance activity across the planet, represented by thousands of red dots that pulsed like an infected wound. What had begun as scattered, disorganized insurgency had evolved into something resembling a planetary immune system, automatically responding to threats and adapting to new circumstances. The mathematics make no sense, the commander's tactical advisor reported. Our casualty ratios are favorable. We eliminate 10 humans for every Zephyrian lost. Their infrastructure is 90% destroyed. Their pre-war population has declined by 30%, yet their operational capability continues to increase. How is this possible? HFY demanded. I found myself speaking before I had consciously decided to. They're not fighting to preserve what they had. They're fighting to become something new. Every eye in the room turned to me. As an observer, I rarely contributed to tactical discussions. HFY's expression showed both surprise and irritation. Explain, he commanded. I activated my data interface, displaying patterns I had been tracking for months. Traditional resistance movements fight to restore previous conditions. They want to return to how things were before conquest, but humans seem to be fighting for something that never existed before. Each loss makes them more unified, more determined, more innovative. The tactical advisor studied my data with growing confusion. You're suggesting they're using our occupation as a catalyst for evolution? Not biological evolution, I clarified. Cultural evolution. Social evolution. They're becoming something they weren't before we arrived. To demonstrate, I showed them communication intercepts from human resistance cells. The language had changed over the months of occupation. New words had emerged, new concepts, new ways of organizing that hadn't existed in human society before the invasion. They were developing new tactics, new technologies, new social structures, all in response to Zephyrian pressure. Impossible, HFY declared. No species can adapt that rapidly. But I had the data. I had the observations. I had interviewed hundreds of human prisoners, and each conversation had revealed new layers of complexity I'd never encountered before. The humans weren't just enduring occupation. They were using it as a forge, hammering themselves into something harder and more resilient with each blow. The breakthrough came when I gained access to what humans called their internet. It was a primitive information network that the Zephyrians had largely ignored because it seemed technologically insignificant. What I discovered there changed everything I thought I understood about human psychology. They were teaching each other, constantly, obsessively, relentlessly, not just practical skills like making explosives or evading patrols, but deeper lessons about endurance, sacrifice, and collective purpose. Stories were being shared, refined, and retold. Heroes were emerging not from military ranks but from ordinary citizens who had chosen to act, despite overwhelming odds. I found recordings of humans who knew they were about to die, leaving messages for others they would never meet. Messages of encouragement, tactical advice, philosophical insights. They weren't just fighting for their own survival. They were fighting to preserve and pass on something intangible but immensely powerful. Maya had been scheduled for execution along with 12 other young couriers. I watched from the observation deck as they were led to the execution site, a cleared area in what had once been Central Park. Standard procedure called for public executions to serve as deterrents to other potential insurgents. But, as the young humans stood before the Zephyrian firing squad, something unexpected happened. They began to sing. It started with Maya's voice, high and clear in the morning air, joined quickly by the others. The song spread to human civilians who had been forced to witness the execution. Within minutes, hundreds of voices were raised together in harmony. I didn't recognize the melody, but my translation matrix rendered the lyrics. We shall overcome, we shall overcome, we shall overcome someday. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. The Zephyrian soldiers executed the prisoners as ordered, but the singing continued. It spread through the crowd and beyond, carried by hidden communication networks to other parts of the city, other parts of the continent, other parts of the world. By sunset, intelligence reports indicated that the same song was being sung in human settlements across the planet. That night, I sat in my quarters staring at my recorded observations, trying to understand what I had witnessed. The execution had been intended to break human morale. Instead, it had somehow strengthened it. The death of these 12 young people had become a source of inspiration that would likely fuel resistance for years to come. For the first time in my career as an observer, I began to question whether neutrality was always the correct choice. The human they brought in next changed everything I thought I understood about courage. His name was David Okafor, a former engineer who had been captured leading a team that had somehow managed to turn the Zephyrians' own technology against them. He had constructed weapons from salvaged alien components that were more effective than anything in the original human arsenal. David wasn't like the other prisoners I had interviewed. Where others showed quiet determination or defiant hope, he displayed something I could only describe as scholarly curiosity. Even under restraint, facing certain execution, he studied his captors with the intensity of a researcher examining a fascinating specimen. "You're the Veltar observer," he said when I entered his cell. "I've been hoping to meet you." His casual tone caught me off guard. Most prisoners either cowered in fear or blazed with anger. David seemed almost pleased by the encounter. "You've been hoping to meet me?" I asked. "Of course. You're the only one here who might appreciate what's really happening." He leaned forward as much as his restraints allowed. "Tell me, in all your observations of conquered species, have you ever seen anything like this?" The question disturbed me because I had been asking myself the same thing for weeks. "What exactly do you think is happening?" David smiled, and there was something unsettling about the expression. Not because it was threatening, but because it was genuinely happy. Here was a man facing torture and death, and he was smiling as if he had discovered something wonderful. "We're becoming something new," he said. "Something that never existed before in galactic history. Your people have been watching civilizations rise and fall for millennia, right? Recording patterns, documenting cycles of conquest and collapse. But you've never seen this pattern before, have you?" I had to admit he was correct. The human response to occupation defied every historical precedent in my archives. Conquered species either submitted, died fighting conventionally, or gradually succumbed to despair. They didn't transform into something more dangerous than they had been before conquest. "How do you know about our archives?" I asked. "We've been monitoring your transmissions for months. Not the content, obviously, but the patterns. The frequency of your reports has been increasing steadily. That suggests you're encountering something outside your normal parameters." David's eyes gleamed with intellectual excitement. "We're a puzzle you can't solve, aren't we?" Before I could respond, he continued. "The Zephyrians think they're fighting an insurgency, but insurgencies are reactive. They respond to occupation forces, try to restore previous conditions. We're not doing that. We're using their pressure to forge ourselves into something entirely different." "Different how?" "Think about it. Before your friends arrived, humanity was divided into nearly 200 separate nations. We fought each other constantly over resources, territory, ideology. We couldn't agree on anything significant. But now," he gestured toward the ceiling, indicating the world beyond. "Now we're united by something more powerful than any government or belief system ever was." I had noticed the dissolution of previous human political structures, but I had attributed it to the chaos of occupation. David was suggesting something far more complex was occurring. "Show me your data on human coordination patterns," he said. The request was absurd. No prisoner should have access to classified intelligence. Yet something about his confidence made me curious enough to activate a basic display showing resistance communication networks. David studied the holographic web of connections with obvious delight. "Beautiful. Do you see it? This isn't command and control in any traditional sense. There's no central authority issuing orders. Instead, it's more like a neural network. Each node operating independently but somehow contributing to an emergent intelligence." I stared at the display with new eyes. The pattern did resemble biological neural networks I had studied in various species. But neural networks required millions of connections to achieve consciousness. The human resistance network encompassed millions of individuals across an entire planet. "You're suggesting your species is developing collective consciousness?" I asked. "Not consciousness exactly," David replied. "Something more practical but equally unprecedented. collective purpose, shared determination that transcends individual survival instincts. We're becoming a species that defines itself through resistance to external control. The implications were staggering. If David was correct, the Zephyrian occupation wasn't just failing to conquer humanity. It was accidentally creating something that had never existed before, a species-wide immune response to domination. Over the following days, I found myself testing David's hypothesis against my accumulated observations. The evidence was overwhelming once I knew what to look for. Human resistance wasn't decreasing with casualties. It was becoming more sophisticated, more adaptive, more unified. Each Zephyrian tactical innovation was met within days by human countermeasures. Each attempt at psychological warfare backfired, strengthening rather than weakening human resolve. The transformation wasn't limited to military resistance. I began monitoring human cultural productions during the occupation. Art, music, literature, philosophy, everything was evolving at an unprecedented rate. New forms of expression were emerging that had no historical precedent. They were creating cultural artifacts that celebrated sacrifice, unity, and defiance in ways that transcended traditional human artistic traditions. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that human children born during the occupation were displaying cognitive and behavioral patterns unlike anything in pre-invasion populations. They showed enhanced cooperation abilities, reduced individual aggression, and an intuitive understanding of complex system dynamics. The occupation wasn't just changing human culture, it was changing human evolution itself. Commander HFY called another strategy session. The situation had deteriorated beyond all projections. 3 Zephyrian worlds had been forced to contribute additional forces to maintain the occupation. Resource extraction from Earth had fallen to negligible levels. The conquest that should have been completed in months was entering its 3rd year with no end in sight. Perhaps it's time to consider alternative approaches, I suggested during the briefing. Alternative approaches? HFY's voice carried dangerous undertones. Negotiation, withdrawal, recognition that this occupation cannot succeed under any circumstances. The commander's forearms spread in a gesture of contempt. The Zephyrian Empire does not negotiate with inferior species. We do not withdraw from conquered territories. We certainly do not recognize the sovereignty of primitives. Then you will lose, I said quietly. The statement hung in the air like a physical presence. No one had ever spoken such words to a Zephyrian commander before. The concept was literally unthinkable within their cultural framework. Explain, HFY commanded, his voice deadly calm. I activated my full database of observations, displaying patterns that had been building for months. Human resistance capacity is increasing exponentially. Their technological adaptation rate exceeds your ability to counter it. Their psychological resilience grows stronger under pressure rather than weaker. Most critically, they're developing capabilities that didn't exist before occupation began. The tactical advisors studied my data with growing alarm. The mathematical projections were clear. If current trends continued, human resistance would eventually exceed Zephyrian suppression capacity regardless of reinforcements. You're suggesting that primitives who barely achieved spaceflight 50 years ago will defeat the greatest military force in the galaxy? HFY asked. I'm suggesting that you've accidentally created something that never existed before. A species with no upper limit on adaptation under pressure. The harder you push, the stronger they become. The more you take from them, the more unified they grow. You're not conquering them. You're forging them into something that cannot be conquered by anyone. That night, I sat alone in my quarters, staring out at the blue world that had become the center of my existence. Somewhere down there in hidden bunkers and ruined cities, millions of humans were preparing for another day of impossible resistance. They would lose most of their battles. Many would die. But each loss would somehow make them stronger, more determined, more dangerous. For the first time in my centuries of observation, I was witnessing the birth of something genuinely new in the galaxy. Not just another species, another civilization, another conquest, but a form of life that transformed external pressure into internal strength, that used suffering as a catalyst for evolution. that seemed to grow more powerful with each attempt to destroy it. I began to understand what Sarah Chen had meant when she talked about what comes after. What David Okafor had meant about becoming something new. What young Maya had meant about hope being something you create. The humans weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting to prove that some things in the universe could not be broken, could not be conquered, could not be forced to submit. They were demonstrating that consciousness itself, when pushed far enough, could become an unconquerable force. And I was beginning to suspect that they were succeeding. The day I met Elena Vasquez, I finally understood what it meant to witness the impossible become inevitable. She was brought aboard our ship after leading the most audacious resistance operation yet attempted. The liberation of an entire Zephyrian prison complex containing over 2,000 human captives. What made the operation remarkable wasn't just its success, but the fact that Elena had organized it while being held in solitary confinement in a different facility entirely. How? I asked her during our interview, genuinely baffled. How do you coordinate complex operations while completely isolated from your network? Elena studied me with eyes that held depths I was only beginning to recognize in human prisoners. You still don't understand, do you? You keep thinking of us as individuals working together, but we're not individuals anymore. Not in the way we used to be. She was 28 standard years old, a former teacher who had never received military training before the invasion. Yet she had somehow developed tactical abilities that surpassed many professional Zephyrian officers. Her psychological profile showed none of the trauma markers that should have been present after 3 years of occupation and 6 months of imprisonment. Explain what you mean, I said before your people arrived. I taught children mathematics in a small school in Mexico. I was nobody special. I had never led anything more complex than a parent-teacher conference. She smiled at the memory. But occupation changes you. Suffering changes you. Loss changes you, not by breaking you down, but by burning away everything that isn't essential. I had heard variations of this theme from dozens of prisoners, but Elena articulated it with unusual clarity. What remains after this burning away? What we share, she said simply. What connects us to each other and to something larger than ourselves. You've been documenting our resistance activities, but you've missed the most important part. We're not just fighting your occupation. We're discovering what we really are when everything else is stripped away. Elena's words echoed conversations I had recorded across the planet. Humans from different cultures, languages, and backgrounds were developing remarkably similar philosophical frameworks. They spoke of discovering essential human nature through extremity, of finding unbreakable connections with others through shared suffering, of accessing strength they never knew they possessed. What disturbed me most was the accumulating evidence that they were correct. Human resistance operations were displaying coordination levels that shouldn't have been possible without centralized command structures. Yet intelligence indicated no such structures existed. Instead, resistance cells seemed to operate through some form of distributed decision-making that resembled the behavior of complex biological systems. Show me how you coordinated the prison liberation, I requested. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, as if accessing memories carefully stored away. I knew the prison schedule because Maria Santos had been held there for 2 months before being transferred to my facility. She told me everything during the 10 minutes we shared a transport vehicle. I knew the guard rotations because Chen Wei had observed them during his escape attempt. His sister passed that information to my cell block through the cleaning crews. She opened her eyes and looked at me directly. I knew the layout of the ventilation system because Anna Petrov had maintained it before the war. She drew diagrams on her cell wall using fingernail scratches. Those diagrams were memorized by her cellmate, who was released and shared them with her cousin, who worked in the prison kitchen, who told them to the priest who brought weekly rations, who passed them to my network. The complexity was staggering. Elena was describing an information network that spanned thousands of individuals, maintained perfect accuracy across dozens of transmissions, and operated without any form of electronic communication or written records. It should have been impossible. How do you maintain accuracy across so many transmissions? I asked. Because we're not just sharing information, Elena replied. We're sharing purpose. When you truly understand why something matters, you remember it perfectly. When you know that someone's life depends on getting the details right, you don't make mistakes. I began to understand that I had been documenting something far more significant than a military resistance. I was witnessing the emergence of a new form of consciousness, one that existed not within individual minds but in the connections between them. The humans weren't just sharing information, they were sharing awareness itself. This hypothesis was supported by reports from other Zephyrian observers stationed throughout the occupied territories. Human resistance operations displayed impossible levels of synchronization across vast distances. Attacks on multiple continents would begin simultaneously, despite no apparent communication between groups. Tactical innovations would appear on one continent and spread globally, within days through mechanisms that intelligence couldn't identify. The Zephyrian Empire had conquered 47 species across the galaxy. In every previous case, occupation had followed predictable patterns. Initial resistance would gradually diminish as populations adapted to new circumstances. Cultural assimilation would begin within 5 years. Complete integration would occur within a generation. The human occupation was now in its 4th year, and every trend was moving in the opposite direction. Human cultural distinctiveness was increasing rather than diminishing. Their resistance capacity was growing exponentially. Most alarming of all, they were beginning to demonstrate capabilities that exceeded their pre-invasion limitations. I documented evidence of humans performing feats of physical endurance that shouldn't have been possible, given their biological constraints. Prisoners who had been tortured for months showed no signs of psychological breakdown. Resistance fighters operated effectively after injuries that should have been incapacitating. Children born during occupation displayed cognitive abilities that exceeded baseline human norms. We're becoming what we need to become, Elena explained when I shared these observations with her. Occupation is pressure. Pressure creates transformation. Every species in the galaxy has adapted to their environmental pressures. We're adapting to yours. But adaptation takes generations, millennia, I protested. Biological adaptation, yes. But we're not just biological anymore. We're something new, something that can adapt as fast as circumstances require. Elena's execution was scheduled for the following day. She would join the thousands of other human prisoners who had been terminated for resistance activities. Yet somehow I knew that her death would accomplish the opposite of its intended effect. Like every other execution I had witnessed, it would become a source of inspiration that would fuel further resistance. Aren't you afraid? I asked her the same question I had posed to Sarah Chen years earlier. Fear is irrelevant, Elena replied. What matters is what continues after I'm gone, and I know that everything important will continue. The connections I've helped create, the purpose I've shared, the part of me that matters most. None of that can be destroyed. That night, I transmitted my preliminary report to the Veltar archives. For the first time in my career, I found myself struggling to maintain the objective tone required of observers. The patterns I was documenting challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness, evolution, and the nature of sentient life itself. The humans were demonstrating that intelligence could transcend individual limitations when faced with sufficient pressure. They were proving that some forms of life became stronger rather than weaker, under extreme stress. Most significantly, they were showing that consciousness itself could evolve in real time when survival demanded it. I was no longer observing a military occupation. I was witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in galactic history. A species that had learned to transform external pressure into internal evolution, suffering into strength, loss into unity. A species that was becoming more than the sum of its individual parts. Elena's execution proceeded as scheduled. She died with the same quiet dignity I had observed in hundreds of other human prisoners. Her last words were not a plea for mercy or a curse against her executioners. Instead, she simply said, "Remember what we're becoming." Those words would haunt me for the remainder of my assignment, because I was beginning to realize that the humans weren't just becoming something new, they were becoming something that could not be stopped, could not be conquered, could not be destroyed by any force in the galaxy. And I was starting to suspect that this transformation was exactly what they had intended all along. The moment I realized the true scope of what was happening came during what Zephyrian Command called the 7-Hour War. Though it wasn't really a war at all. It was something far more disturbing. A perfect demonstration of what humans had become after 4 years of occupation. It began when Zephyrian intelligence detected massive human troop movements across all continents. After years of fighting scattered resistance cells, they suddenly faced the prospect of organized military action on a global scale. Commander HFY ordered immediate preemptive strikes against all identified human positions. The orbital bombardment lasted exactly 17 minutes. Zephyrian warships unleashed enough firepower to level mountain ranges, targeting every known resistance base, supply depot, and communication hub on the planet. When the bombardment ended, thermal imaging showed no signs of life at any of the targeted locations. Finally, HFY declared with satisfaction, "We should have done this years ago." Sometimes the only solution is complete elimination of resistance capacity. But within hours, reports began flooding in that made no sense. Human attacks were occurring simultaneously across the globe, not from the positions that had been destroyed, but from locations that had never appeared on any intelligence maps. The attacks displayed coordination that should have been impossible without the communication networks that had just been eliminated. More disturbing still was the nature of the attacks themselves. The humans weren't using improvised weapons or captured Zephyrian technology. They were deploying equipment that exceeded Zephyrian specifications in every measurable category. Somehow, during 4 years of occupation, while fighting a desperate resistance, they had managed to develop technology that surpassed their conquerors. I requested access to the tactical displays and immediately noticed patterns that defied every principle of military strategy I had ever studied. The human attacks weren't random or opportunistic. They formed a complex, interwoven pattern that simultaneously targeted Zephyrian supply lines, communication networks, command structures, and resource extraction facilities. What made the pattern impossible was its scale. The attacks were occurring on 6 continents across 12 time zones, involving an estimated 50,000 individual operations. The coordination required would have challenged the computational capacity of Zephyrian strategic AI systems. Yet the humans were somehow managing it with no apparent central command structure. "How are they communicating?" demanded the tactical advisor, studying reports that showed perfect synchronization between attacks separated by thousands of miles. I had been asking myself the same question for months. The answer, when it finally came to me, was both simple and terrifying. "They're not communicating," I said. "Not in any way we understand communication." The briefing room fell silent.
6.
High turned his attention to me with the dangerous focus of a predator evaluating prey. "Explain," he commanded. I activated my analysis of human behavior patterns accumulated over 4 years of observation. Traditional communication requires encoding information, transmitting it, and decoding it at the destination. But what if consciousness itself could be shared directly between individuals? What if separate minds could function as components of a larger intelligence? The concept was so alien to Zephyrian thinking that several officers made sounds of disgust. Their species had evolved from solitary hunters. The idea of shared consciousness violated their most basic psychological assumptions. "You're suggesting these primitives?" The evacuation order came at dawn on the 5th anniversary of the initial invasion. Commander HFY stood before the holographic display showing Earth one final time, his forearms hanging in defeat. Around him, tactical officers prepared reports that would fundamentally challenge everything the Zephyrian Empire believed about conquest, resistance, and the nature of sentient life itself. "Casualties?" he asked his aide. 47% of occupation forces eliminated or incapacitated, 63% of equipment destroyed or compromised, resource extraction, 0 for the past 8 months. The aide's voice carried the exhaustion of an army that had fought an impossible war. Estimated time to restore combat effectiveness, 18 months minimum. I watched this exchange while preparing my own final reports for the Veltar archives. In 5 years of observation, I had documented the complete transformation of both predator and prey. The Zephyrians had entered this system as an unstoppable conquering force. They were leaving as something I could only describe as humbled. The humans had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history. They had not merely survived conquest by a superior force. They had transformed their conqueror's strength into weakness, turned occupation into education, converted suffering into evolution. They had proven that some forms of life become more dangerous when threatened rather than less. "Sir," the tactical advisor interrupted my thoughts. "We're receiving a transmission from the surface. It's unusual." The main display activated to show a human woman standing in what appeared to be the ruins of New York. She was elderly, perhaps 70 standard years old, wearing simple clothes that had been mended multiple times. Behind her, other humans worked to clear debris and rebuild structures damaged during the occupation. They moved with the coordinated efficiency I had come to recognize as the hallmark of their new collective consciousness. "I am Rachel Martinez," she said, speaking in perfect galactic standard. "I am authorized to speak for the people of Earth." Commander Zexhai stepped forward, his pride warring with pragmatism. "The Zephyrian Empire does not negotiate with subject populations." Rachel smiled with the gentle patience of someone addressing a confused child. "We are no longer a subject population. We never truly were. We are something you could not understand when you arrived, and something you cannot control now that you are leaving." "You speak of your departure as if it were inevitable," Zexhai replied. "We are choosing to redeploy our forces. This is a tactical decision, not a retreat." "Of course," Rachel agreed, though her tone suggested she was humoring him. "And we are choosing to let you leave. This is a mercy, not an inability to prevent your escape." The implied threat hung in the air like a living thing. Every Zephyrian in the command center understood that the humans could have destroyed their fleet at any point during the past year. The fact that they were choosing not to do so was somehow more terrifying than if they had simply attacked. "What do you want?" Zexhai asked finally. "To give you a message to carry to the galaxy," Rachel replied. "We are not the same species you invaded 5 years ago. We have become something new. Something that grows stronger under pressure, more unified through suffering, more capable through adversity. We have learned to transform every attack into adaptation, every loss into learning, every defeat into evolution." She paused, looking directly into the camera with eyes that seemed to see beyond the present moment. "Tell the galaxy that Earth is no longer a world that can be conquered. Tell them that humanity is no longer a species that can be enslaved. Tell them that we have become something that makes conquest itself obsolete. Threats will not protect you from future expeditions," Zexhai warned, though his voice lacked conviction. "This is not a threat," Rachel said gently. "This is information. We have no desire to threaten anyone. We have no need to conquer anyone. We have learned to find strength in unity, purpose in resistance, growth in challenge. We offer these lessons freely to any species wise enough to learn them." The transmission ended, leaving the command center in uncomfortable silence. I realized that I had just witnessed something historic. The first time a conquered species had dismissed their conquerors rather than being liberated from them. Over the following days, as Zephyrian forces prepared for departure, I conducted my final interviews with human prisoners. What I discovered completed my understanding of the transformation I had been documenting. The humans were no longer fighting to restore their previous way of life. They had built something entirely new during the occupation, something that incorporated lessons learned through suffering into a more resilient form of civilization. Their technology was more advanced, their social structures more adaptive, their collective consciousness more sophisticated. "We should thank you," said Dr. James Chen, a physicist who had been captured while developing weapons systems that exceeded Zephyrian specifications. "Your invasion forced us to become what we could be rather than remaining what we were. You taught us that consciousness is not limited by individual minds, that strength can be shared, that evolution can happen in real time when survival demands it." I asked him what humanity would do after the Zephyrians left. "We'll continue becoming," he replied. "This transformation isn't finished. It may never be finished. We've learned that growth requires challenge, that strength requires pressure, that evolution requires change. We'll find new challenges, face new pressures, embrace new changes. And if other species attempt conquest in the future," James smiled with the quiet confidence I had learned to recognize in human faces, "they'll become our teachers whether they intend to or not. Every attack makes us stronger. Every attempt at conquest makes us more unified. Every threat makes us more capable." On the final day of evacuation, I stood on the observation deck watching Earth recede into the distance. The blue world looked exactly as it had 5 years earlier, but I knew that everything had changed. The species living on that planet had transformed themselves into something unprecedented in galactic history. My final report to the Veltar archives would challenge fundamental assumptions about consciousness, evolution, and the nature of sentient life. I had documented the emergence of a species-wide intelligence that could adapt in real time to any threat. I had witnessed the birth of a form of life that transformed external pressure into internal strength, that used suffering as a catalyst for growth, that became more dangerous when threatened, rather than less. Commander HFY summoned me to his quarters before we reached the edge of the system. He looked older than when I had first met him, worn down by 5 years of fighting an enemy that became stronger with every defeat. "Your final assessment," he requested. "Humanity has evolved beyond the possibility of conquest," I told him. "Any future attempt to subdue them will only accelerate their development. They have learned to transform resistance into resilience, unity into strength, challenge into opportunity. Recommendations?" I considered my words carefully. "Leave them alone. Learn from them if possible, but never attempt to conquer them again. They have become something that makes conquest meaningless." HFY was quiet for a long moment. "My report to High Command will recommend that Earth be designated as a forbidden zone. No Zephyrian vessel should approach that system again." "A wise decision," I agreed. As our ship entered hyperspace, leaving the Sol system behind, I reflected on the implications of what I had witnessed. Humanity had proven that consciousness could transcend individual limitations when faced with sufficient pressure. They had demonstrated that some forms of life become stronger, rather than weaker under extreme stress. Most importantly, they had shown that evolution itself could be accelerated through conscious choice rather than random mutation. The galaxy would never be the same. Word of humanity's transformation would spread through diplomatic channels, trade networks, and intelligence services. Other species would learn that conquest was no longer guaranteed, that some prey could become predators, that consciousness itself could evolve beyond previous limitations. I had come to Earth as an observer, tasked with documenting another routine conquest. I was leaving as a witness to the birth of something that would change the fundamental balance of power in the galaxy. The humans had not just survived their trial by fire, they had used it to forge themselves into something unconquerable, unstoppable, and ultimately, unforgettable. 20 years have passed since the Zephyrian evacuation from Earth, and I find myself returning to Sol system not as an observer, but as something I never expected to become, a student. The Veltar High Council has assigned me to lead the first formal diplomatic mission to humanity, a species that has fundamentally altered the political landscape of the galaxy. The ship emerging from hyperspace bears little resemblance to the Zephyrian warship I departed on decades ago. This vessel carries representatives from 47 different species, all seeking to understand the phenomenon that has transformed galactic civilization. The humans have become something unprecedented, a species that other species actively seek to learn from rather than conquer. "Approaching Earth orbit," announced Captain Kethvar, a Trilaxian whose species had recently survived their own attempted conquest by following tactical principles derived from human resistance strategies. "We're being hailed on multiple channels." The main display activated to show a human man perhaps 50 years old, wearing clothes that seemed to shimmer with embedded technology I couldn't identify. Behind him, through what appeared to be a transparent wall, I could see Earth hanging in space, not the blue marble I remembered, but something that seemed to pulse with subtle energy patterns. "Welcome back," the human said, and I realized with shock that he was addressing me directly. "Observer Vexthalan of the Veltar, we've been expecting you." "You know me?" I asked, though I shouldn't have been surprised. Human information networks had become legendary throughout the galaxy. "Of course. Your observations during the occupation are studied in every academy on Earth. You were the first galactic citizen to recognize what we were becoming. In many ways, you helped us understand ourselves." The human smiled with genuine warmth. "I'm Administrator Chen Wei, grandson of the Dr. Chen you interviewed 20 years ago. Please come aboard our station. There's much to show you." The space station that had materialized around us defied every principle of engineering I understood. It seemed to grow organically from Earth's orbital space, extending tendrils of energy and matter that connected it to similar structures throughout the system. The technology was clearly beyond anything that had existed during the occupation, but more disturbing was the way it seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the planet itself. "How is this possible?" asked Dr. Zara Fenn, a Kavarian physicist who had spent decades studying human technological developments from afar. "Our calculations suggest this level of construction should require centuries, not decades." Time moves differently when consciousness can be shared across an entire species, Administrator Chen replied as we docked with the station. When millions of minds can focus on a single problem simultaneously, solutions emerge that would be impossible for individual thinkers. As we disembarked, I found myself in an environment that challenged every assumption about space habitation. The corridors seemed to reshape themselves as we moved through them, adapting to our needs in real time. The very walls pulsed with patterns of light that reminded me of neural activity, as if the station itself was thinking. "Your species has integrated with your technology," observed Captain Kethvar, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and concern. "Integration is too simple a word," Chen replied. "We've learned to extend consciousness beyond biological boundaries. Technology isn't something we use anymore. It's something we are." The implications were staggering. During the occupation, I had documented humanity's development of collective consciousness. Now it appeared they had expanded that consciousness to include their artificial creations, their constructions, even their planetary environment itself. We were led to what Chen called the memory hall, a vast chamber filled with floating displays that showed scenes from throughout human history. I recognized many of them from my own observations during the occupation. Resistance fighters coordinating impossible operations, prisoners maintaining hope in the face of certain death, children born during wartime who displayed capabilities beyond baseline human norms. "We preserve everything," Chen explained. "Every moment of struggle, every lesson learned through suffering, every step in our evolution. Not just as records, but as living experiences that continue to shape who we become." I approached one display showing the execution of young Maya, the child courier whose death had sparked planet-wide singing. The image was three-dimensional and seemed to pulse with emotional resonance that I could feel despite my alien physiology. "She's still with us," Chen said softly, noticing my attention. "Not as a ghost or a memory, but as part of the collective consciousness that guides our species. Her courage, her determination, her refusal to surrender, all of that continues to live and grow within us." Dr. Fenn was studying technical displays that showed the current state of human civilization. "Your population has tripled since the occupation, but your resource consumption has decreased. How is this possible?" "We've learned to think like an ecosystem rather than a collection of individuals," Chen replied. "Every action is evaluated for its impact on the whole. Every decision is made with full awareness of its consequences for all humanity. When consciousness is shared, waste becomes impossible because you're literally wasting parts of yourself." The tour continued through areas that demonstrated humanity's transformation across every aspect of existence. Their art was created collectively, with thousands of minds contributing to single works that expressed concepts impossible for individual artists. Their science advanced through shared intuition that allowed breakthrough discoveries to emerge simultaneously across the planet. Their philosophy had evolved beyond individual ethics to encompass species-wide moral reasoning. But the most profound change was evident in the humans themselves. Every person we met displayed the same quiet confidence I had recognized in prisoners during the occupation. They moved with perfect coordination when cooperation was needed, yet maintained distinct personalities and perspectives. They had somehow achieved collective consciousness without sacrificing individual identity. "How do you prevent homogenization?" asked Ambassador Sil Thek, an Xarian whose own species had attempted collective consciousness experiments that resulted in the loss of individual thought. "How do you maintain diversity within unity?" "Because unity isn't uniformity," Chen replied. "A symphony isn't improved by having every instrument play the same note. Collective consciousness works the same way. Every individual perspective makes the whole more capable, more creative, more resilient." On our final day, Chen brought us to Earth's surface to the memorial that had been built on the site of the former Zephyrian command base. It was a garden of extraordinary beauty, with plants and structures that seemed to grow according to patterns too complex for my mind to fully grasp. At the center stood a simple stone bearing names, thousands of them, representing humans who had died during the occupation. But these weren't just carved letters. Each name pulsed with the same light I had seen throughout human space, as if the memorial itself was alive with the consciousness of those it honored. "They're all still here," Chen said, placing his hand on the stone. "Their experiences, their wisdom, their strength, all of it continues to guide us. Death doesn't end consciousness when consciousness itself can be shared. I realized then that I was witnessing something beyond evolution, beyond adaptation, beyond anything my species had imagined possible. The humans hadn't just survived conquest. They had used it as a catalyst to transcend the limitations of individual existence entirely. They had become something that existed simultaneously as separate beings and as a unified entity, as mortal individuals and as an immortal collective. What happens now? I asked. Where does humanity go from here? Chen smiled with the same expression I had seen on so many human faces during the occupation. Hope tempered by determination. Strength forged through suffering, wisdom earned through endurance. We become what the galaxy needs us to become, he said. We've learned that consciousness is not limited by biology, that intelligence can transcend individual minds, that love and unity and hope are forces as real and powerful as gravity or electromagnetism. We'll share these lessons with any species ready to learn them, and if others resist, if they try to conquer you as the Zephyrians did, then they'll become our teachers just as the Zephyrians did. Every challenge makes us stronger. Every attack makes us more unified. Every attempt to break us helps us discover new ways to grow. Chen looked up at the stars beginning to appear in Earth's twilight sky. We've learned that there is no limit to what consciousness can become when it chooses love over fear, unity over division, growth over stagnation. As our diplomatic mission prepared to depart, I found myself fundamentally changed by what I had witnessed. I was no longer just an observer recording the actions of other species. I had become an advocate for something I was only beginning to understand, the possibility that consciousness itself could evolve beyond all previous limitations. My final report to the Veltar archives would be unlike anything in our historical records. I was documenting not just the survival of a species, but the birth of a new form of existence that offered hope for every sentient being in the galaxy.